I spend a lot of my time working with leaders to help them think about what kind of leader do they want to be, given the context that they work in. And so I help them think about how do they trust themselves, how do they think about and deal with risk, and how do they work with others relationally, but also as their boss. But it's important to know I'm not a risk expert, so I don't have a canon of knowledge about being a risk expert. But I do have a lot of experience about how people think, feel and act, and particularly under pressure. I spent the first 10 years of my working career working in the life market, Financial Futures Exchange in London, as a broker, lots of sounds, sights, noise, shouting, hand signals, and being very interested in how people relate to each other, how they trust each other, what role does power have when you're working in a place like that, as well as thinking about the numbers and the risk and the loss and the gains. I've also looked at around the world yacht race, thinking about how does team and leadership come together when you're stuck together on a boat at weeks at a time. I looked at risk in terms of thinking about how do people think about and deal with risk, but from a very human perspective. And I also looked at integrity under pressure, and I put myself under pressure for a year, pretty much experimenting with pressure to see how I responded and then work with others to help see how they responded. So I really have a relatively good understanding of how people think, feel and act, and particularly when they're under pressure, but also how they make their decisions. And often I find people lose faith in their own instincts about the choices that they have. And they tend to either want to go and collect lots of data, or they wait for the platform to burn so that they can then justify themselves and the decisions that they make. And in the risk research, we ask people, well, how do you define risk? What do you think risk is? And of course, lots of people said it was threat, danger, things that were going to put them in jeopardy. But as many people said, it was about the opportunities that they had. So working out the balance between the risks and the opportunities. Some people described it as a noun, some people described it as a verb. So it was quite clear from the research that we did that there wasn't one clear understanding of what risk is and the vocabulary required to have really good conversations about that. What we found was there were kind of two types of risk. One was the formal. So this is where there is actually death and destruction, financial ruin. There's risk in not mitigating. So for some outcomes, the risk in not mitigating is as bad as the risk itself. And absolutely justifiably, because we want to keep people safe. There was also an informal risk, where there was as much about opportunity as there was risk and danger. So being able to scan the horizon for those opportunities and working out where that might come from. It required much more of a capacity to want to look, to be able to think about what are the implications for me in this. It required a shared accountability. So with the formal risk, that was more of a personal accountability. Your name is on that. So if we're mitigating against death and destruction and financial ruin, your name is on that. In the informal risk, it's much more about a shared accountability. So we are working together to think about, well, so what does this mean for us? And this is the housing for innovation. This is where we're looking for opportunities for growth and for progress. And this is not a dichotomy, it's not one or the other. And we found it was both. And so the leaders that we spoke to, helped for them to recognise they needed to balance both progress and process to be able to leave a trail of where they've been, but also set the trail for where they wanted to go and to open up the world to them. And really it depended on how the organisation was structured. And when we're talking with leaders and we're introducing them, often the client wants us to help their leaders be more innovative, to be more agile, to take more responsibility, to make decisions for themselves. And often we'll say, and this is some of the ways that you can be more innovative. And sometimes we get resistance from people. It's like, well, here's not the place for innovation. We're dealing with people's lives. And to some degree that's true. Because for the organisations I work with, some of them are literally dealing with people's lives. But maybe 20% of them and 20% of the time, what's happening all the rest of the time? And where are the opportunities for innovation that are lost because of the mindset that comes from that more formal risk, which is limiting and keeping people safe? So what I'm often asking people to do is, what's actually a risk? So if we take the time to notice what is actually the risk that we're dealing with here, And it's a very simple story, but several years ago I was working with a client to help deliver a program for 65 young leaders. They were just on the cusp of leaving their context of being the expert and becoming managers and leaders for people to help them grow and flourish. And as such, we were helping them by setting up action learning sets that they could work together with the challenges they were facing as this transition was occurring. And we were trying to think about how can we bring them together to get them into teams to get out there and actually do the work together to use the opportunity for growth. And we were standing wondering what we could do, and where I work is literally beautiful grounds and a forest. And we have a treasure hunt that was designed by one of my colleagues. And I said, well, we could use the treasure hunt. We could use the treasure hunt as an opportunity for them to come together as teams, to work as a team. So as they're forming and storming, they could come together and then use that as an opportunity to reflect upon about how do we actually develop teams, good work, team working. And he liked this idea. And I then remembered that it was going to be later in the year in England, October time, it's autumn, it's dark by about 3 o'clock, and it tends to be wet. So as I was thinking about this treasure hunt, I was thinking, well, we do need to think about safety aspects. And my client, a very tall Dutch guy, said, oh, I'm Dutch. We don't worry about health and safety checklists. We let people be adults. We let them make their own decisions about how they want to work. And I felt myself go, no, I'm not interested in the health and safety checklist. I'm actually thinking about 65 young leaders running around a forest. I don't want anyone to get hurt. And in that moment he said, oh yeah, no, you're right. And he smiled and he said, and as an American company, if anything were to happen to them, we'd sue. And so in that moment I thought, I know he's joking, but I'm not going to take any risks. And I did a full risk assessment with my colleague. Now, of course, we might limit a little bit about who might get hurt, but it's not actually going to stop someone getting hurt. It's going to stop us being litigated against, and that's a different risk. In the research we found, and I just think this is such a lovely phrase, risk is a human endeavour. And as a human endeavour, it requires a human response. So even in command and control are the constraints that we're working in. Command is not what people tell you to do. Command is the human creativity and will to act and decide into those controls. What is it I need to do to get from here to here, given the capacity that I have, the human creativity that I have, and the will that I have to decide? And as part of that human aspect of it, the most complicated algorithm that's designed to manage and think about and mitigate against risk in the formal sense is still designed by a human with human fallibilities to some degree, human biases. And the stories we tell ourselves can be very compelling around what it is that we think we're dealing with. We found two types of illusion in the research. One was the formal risk, was that someone somewhere must be dealing with this. So people were getting their risk and kind of going, oh, I've not seen this risk before. I'm sure someone knows it. Someone cleverer than me knows about this risk. Someone else is thinking about it and they'd pop it on their shelf. And all around the company, there'd be the same risk sitting on a shelf, just waiting to happen. And the illusion from the informal side was more around that there was common sense was enough. And what we discovered, of course, that common sense is neither common nor always makes sense to the other person. So what are those illusions that we're playing with when we're thinking about dealing with risk? We tend to want to control, we want to see things that are certain. Dealing with ambiguity is difficult, dealing with change is difficult. So recognising that balance between the want to control and where can we let go. And I would argue that defence against anxiety is already part of a governance structure that we are working with, formally or informally. We have anxiety in our system and we're trying to defend against keeping things safe because of how it makes us feel, rather than actually what are we defending ourselves against in terms of risk. So why not trust? Why not trust as part of that governance mechanism? Not as some sort of ultimate utopia or some sort of benevolent offering, but just as a way to think about how do I trust myself and how do I trust you, and developing that capability to be able to do that well. So thinking about risk and the effort and time and the resources involved in trying to control against it. If you're thinking about the effort and time involved in not trusting, if I don't trust you, I constantly have to come back to, have they done that? Are they doing that how I want them to? And every single time, it's Whereas ultimately, trusting you is one decision. It's just one decision. And yet we get ourselves tied up in not thinking about the controls. And as I say, if it's mitigating against real risk, then it's absolutely valid and justifiable. It's just learning to challenge ourselves of what is actually at risk. So trust in self, trust in other, and how do we deliberate with that? So the deliberation process, either in self, so working out what it is that I'm trying to understand and get to the bottom of, but also deliberation with others. Really good deliberation is a human endeavour. Really good, robust communication, being able to deal with conflict and with care is a human endeavour. To be able to balance, so the word deliberation is broken down etymologically as liber, balance, and libre, freedom. To be able to go without hindrance, so to be able to make a decision and move without hindrance for yourself and with others. So what if trust were part of that governance mechanism? What would that look like? What could that look like? How could we develop that? So I argue that around, if you start with being able to pause and notice what is actually at risk. What is the risk that I'm actually dealing with? Getting to know yourself. So getting to know yourself, your values, the beliefs that you have, and challenge some of those assumptions. So our values that we value are very strong and they come up when we're under pressure. And the beliefs, the opinions that we treat as facts, as if they are true, when they're not necessarily. They might have some truth in them, but how do we develop the capacity to really challenge ourselves and question, where has this come from? And the capacity to even notice it in the first place. Also to check our relationship with power. So where there is informal risk, yes, there are processes involved to keep us safe. But with innovation, with growth, with opportunity, power needs to be more equal. And to check ourselves with, how do I treat people who have power? How do I offer my power to others? And how do we separate each other through that power? When sometimes people just pay different amounts of money to take different types of decisions. There isn't literally power. So how do we create some of that in our minds? And back to those stories we tell ourselves, to really be able to get to the heart of what is it that's actually at risk and what's the story that I'm telling myself about what I think is at risk. Because at the end of it all, if you say you want to have innovation while dealing with risk, you have to think, feel and act as if you do. Thank you very much.